There's a secret buried in the bones of Britain, a genetic crime scene so massive, so complete, that for decades archaeologists refused to believe what the DNA was telling them. Picture this. You're a forensic scientist examining ancient remains. The evidence before you suggests something impossible. In just a few hundred years, a blink of an eye in prehistoric terms, nearly every man in Britain vanished. Not moved away, not assimilated, vanished. Their bloodlines, their Y chromosomes, their very genetic signature, gone. Replaced by strangers. But here's what makes this story truly forbidden. There are no mass graves, no evidence of genocide, no burned settlements stretching across the landscape. Just replacement. Clean, surgical, complete. The most shocking part? This happened not once, but multiple times. And the people we call Celts, the romantic warriors of Braveheart, the druids of Stonehenge, they weren't the original Britons at all. They were the replacers. Tonight, we're going to uncover the most suppressed chapter in British prehistory. The story of how a mysterious group called the Bell Beakers didn't just conquer Britain, they became Britain. And how genetic science has revealed a pattern of population replacement so systematic, so thorough, that it challenges everything we thought we knew about human migration. This is the story of the Celtic DNA reset. Let me ask you something that will haunt you. What does it take to erase 90% of all male lineages from an entire island without leaving a trace of violence? Before we reveal the answer, you need to understand what Britain looked like before the strangers came. 4,000 years before Christ, Britain was paradise for its inhabitants, rolling green hills dotted with the world's first farming communities. These weren't primitive hunter-gatherers. These were sophisticated people whose ancestors had walked from ancient Anatolia, through Spain, up into the cool islands on the edge of the known world. They built Stonehenge. They raised cattle and grew wheat. They created monuments so massive, we still can't figure out how they moved the stones. And based on DNA extracted from skeletons like the famous Cheddar Man, they look nothing like what you'd expect. Forget your mental image of pale red-haired Celts. These original Britons had dark to very dark skin, often paired with striking blue or green eyes. Imagine faces that would look more at home in North Africa than Northern Europe, yet carrying the genetic story of Europe's first farmers. For 15 centuries, their world was stable, unchanging, secure. Then, around 2500 BC, something shifted. New pottery styles appeared in archaeological sites. Distinctive, beautiful, bell-shaped cups decorated with intricate patterns. Archaeologists called their makers the Bell Beaker people. But when scientists extracted DNA from these Bell Beaker graves, they discovered something that shook the entire field of archaeology. The Bell Beaker people weren't descended from Britain's farmers. They came from somewhere else entirely. And within just a few generations of their arrival, those original British male bloodlines, 15 centuries of unbroken ancestry, had almost completely disappeared. How do you make an entire population of men vanish without a single battlefield to mark their passing? What if I told you that your DNA is a crime scene, and scientists have learned to read it like fingerprints? This is where the story gets truly spine-chilling. Modern genetic analysis has turned every ancient bone into a witness, every tooth into testimony. When researchers examined over 200 ancient British genomes, including groundbreaking studies published in Nature, they uncovered what can only be described as a genetic earthquake. Before 2500 BC, British men carried Y DNA haplogroups labeled G2A. These were the genetic signatures of the original farmers, passed down from father to son for millennia. You can think of Y chromosomes as surnames written in genetic code. They reveal unbroken patrilineal descent. After 2500 BC, those G2 lineages had virtually vanished. In their place, R1 BM269 specifically a branch now dominant in Ireland and Wales called R1BL21. This wasn't gradual mixing. This wasn't slow cultural exchange. This was replacement on a scale that geneticists compare to the European colonization of the Americas. But here's the twist that makes this mystery even deeper. The women's DNA tells a different story. While the male lineages disappeared, significant numbers of local Neolithic women continued to pass down their genes. The Bell Beaker men hadn't exterminated the population. They'd integrated with local women while somehow eliminating local men. Think about what this means. Imagine if, in just 300 years, 90% of all surnames in Britain disappeared and were replaced by completely different ones, while the female lineages remained largely intact. That's not conquest as we understand it. That's something else entirely. But who were these Bell Beaker people? And how did they achieve something that seems almost impossible? The answer lies in the vast grasslands of Eastern Europe, the Pontic Steppe, where a revolution was brewing that would reshape the entire continent. This is where our story takes an unexpected turn. The Bell Beaker phenomenon wasn't actually an ethnic group at all. It was something far more complex and far more deadly. Picture the steppe around 3000 BC, endless grasslands stretching from Ukraine to Kazakhstan. Here, nomadic peoples had domesticated horses and invented wheeled vehicles. They were taller than most Europeans, genetically predisposed to greater muscle mass, and carried immunity to diseases that would devastate farming communities. These steppe peoples also possessed revolutionary bronze working technology and had developed a warrior culture centered around archery and mobility. But most importantly, they carried Y chromosome lineages that would come to dominate Europe, R1b and R1a. Around 2800 BC, groups of these steppe-descended people began moving west. As they migrated, they encountered and adopted local cultural innovations, including the Bell Beaker pottery style that had originated in Spain. But here's the crucial insight. The Bell Beaker culture became a kind of franchise system for steppe expansion. Each group that adopted it maintained the core technological and social advantages, metallurgy, archery, mobility, while adapting to local conditions. When genetic analysis revealed the origins of Britain's Bell Beaker people, researchers discovered they weren't Spanish at all, despite adopting Spanish pottery styles. They were steppe-descended migrants who had moved through Central Europe, picking up cultural innovations along the way. They arrived in Britain as small groups of elite warriors and specialists, but they possessed three decisive advantages that would allow them to completely transform the genetic landscape of the islands. The first advantage was technological: bronze weapons, advanced archery, and possibly horses. The second was social, a warrior culture that valued individual prestige over communal cooperation. But the third advantage was invisible, microscopic, and perhaps the most devastating of all. What if the greatest weapon of the Bell Beakers wasn't bronze or arrows, but bacteria they didn't even know they carried? Recent DNA analysis has revealed a hidden passenger in the bones of Bronze Age Europeans, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. But these ancient strains weren't quite the Black Death that would terrorize medieval Europe. They were something more subtle and potentially more deadly to isolated communities. Studies by researchers like Rasmussen and Andrés Valtueña suggest that plague outbreaks swept through Europe around 3000 to 2500 BC, coinciding exactly with the period of steppe expansion. These early plague strains spread rapidly through dense farming populations, but had less impact on mobile groups with natural genetic resistance. Steppe-derived populations, including the Bell Beakers, carried genetic variants in genes like CCR5 that provided resistance to certain pathogens. The same genetic mutations that would later help some Europeans survive the Black Death may have given Bronze Age migrants a crucial advantage over Neolithic farmers. Imagine the scenario. Bell Beaker groups arrive in Britain carrying plague bacteria to which they have genetic resistance. the dense farming communities of the Neolithic Britons, with no previous exposure to these pathogens, face devastating outbreaks. Villages are weakened, populations thinned, social structures collapse. Into this biological catastrophe step small groups of bronze-armed warriors who are not only immune to the plague, but arrive at precisely the moment when local defenses are at their weakest. This wasn't genocide in the traditional sense. It was biological warfare by accident, microscopic colonialism that cleared the land before the first arrow flew. But even plague doesn't fully explain the pattern we see in the DNA. Something else was happening, something that ensured Bell Beaker male lineages would dominate while local women survived to pass on their genes. The final piece of the puzzle isn't written in bronze or bone, but in the most fundamental drive of human survival: reproduction. Archaeological evidence reveals that Bell Beaker society was obsessed with individual status and male prestige. Unlike the Neolithic farmers who buried their dead in communal tombs, Bell Beaker men were buried individually with personal grave goods, copper daggers, archery equipment, drinking vessels, gold ornaments. These weren't just warriors. They were an elite masculine culture that treated warfare and display of wealth as pathways to reproductive success. DNA analysis of Bell Beaker burials reveals a startling pattern. While the men were genetically steppe-derived, many of the women buried alongside them carried significant Neolithic British ancestry. The Bell Beakers weren't exterminating local populations. They were systematically integrating local women, while their male lineages displaced local men. This pattern appears across Europe wherever Bell Beaker material culture appears. In Spain, male lineages shift dramatically around 2000 BC, while female lineages show more continuity. In Germany, Bell Beaker sites reveal mixed ancestry children with stepfathers and local mothers. Think of it as a systematic breeding strategy. Bell Beaker elites arrived as small groups of high-status males. Through a combination of technological superiority, disease resistance, and deliberate marriage alliances, they positioned themselves at the top of social hierarchies. Local women gained protection and access to Bronze Age technology by marrying Bell Beaker men. Local men found themselves increasingly marginalized, their lineages dying out through social rather than physical elimination. Over just a few generations, this strategy achieved what armies might struggle to accomplish: the complete genetic replacement of male lineages without massive warfare. But the Bell Beakers brought more than genes to Britain. They brought a complete cultural transformation that would echo through millennia. When the Bell Beakers arrived, they didn't just change Britain's DNA, they rewrote the rules of civilization itself. Before the Bell Beakers, Britain's Neolithic farmers lived in a world of stone and wood. Their society was communal, egalitarian, focused on collective monuments and shared burials. Individual wealth and status were minimal concepts. The Bell Beakers shattered this world and rebuilt it in bronze. They brought advanced metallurgy, tin-bronze alloys that created tools and weapons harder than anything Britain had ever seen. Copper daggers that could penetrate leather and even early armor. Sophisticated archery equipment, including stone bracers that protected their wrists from bowstring snap. But more than technology, they brought a completely different social philosophy. Bell Beaker society was built around individual achievement and competitive display. Their burials reveal a culture obsessed with personal prestige, fine pottery, gold ornaments, bronze daggers, archery equipment. They also introduced a drinking culture that would become legendary. Chemical analysis of Bell Beaker vessels reveals residues of fermented beverages, ales flavored with herbs and honey, alcohols that played crucial roles in social bonding and ritual display. Perhaps most importantly, they brought horses. While direct evidence of horses in early Bell Beaker Britain remains limited, their steppe origins and the rapid transformation of British society suggests equestrian technology arrived with them. Horses meant mobility. communication, and military advantage that no Neolithic society could match. Within a few centuries, Britain had transformed from a landscape of communal farmers to a society of bronze-working, horse-riding elites ruling over transformed populations. But the Bell Beakers brought something else that would prove even more lasting than bronze or horses: language. Here's where our story enters its most controversial territory. When the Bell Beakers transformed Britain's genetics, did they also transform its tongue? Three competing theories have divided linguists and archaeologists for decades. Theory 1. The Bell Beakers brought Proto-Celtic languages directly from the steppe, establishing Celtic speech in Britain by 2500 BC. Theory 2. Celtic languages only arrived much later, with Iron Age Hallstatt and La Tène cultures, after 700 BC, meaning the Bell Beakers spoke some other Indo-European language that was later replaced. Theory 3. Some remote areas of Britain remained non-Indo-European until Roman times, suggesting linguistic diversity that survived even the Bell Beaker transformation. Recent genetic and archaeological evidence increasingly supports Theory 1. The scale of population replacement associated with the Bell Beakers suggests they brought not just genes, but language. The distribution of R1BL21, the dominant Bell Beaker male lineage, correlates almost perfectly with the later distribution of Celtic languages in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. But here's the twist. River names like Avon, Thames, and Severn may predate even the Bell Beakers. These ancient hydronyms might be linguistic ghosts, remnants of languages older than Celtic, older than Indo-European, echoing from the lips of the Neolithic farmers, whose genes vanished but whose words for water survived. Language, unlike genetics, can jump between populations through contact and intermarriage. The Bell Beaker transformation of Britain might have created a linguistic mosaic: dominant Celtic speech from the conquering elites, substrate influences from integrated Neolithic women, and ancient place names that survived through sheer geographic necessity. This linguistic complexity hints at something crucial about the Bell Beaker phenomenon. It wasn't simple replacement, but a layered transformation that created the cultural foundation for everything we think of as Celtic. Britain's transformation wasn't unique. It was one battleground in a continent-wide revolution that reshaped European civilization. From Ireland to the Black Sea, from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, the same genetic signature appears in the Bronze Age. Dramatic increases in steppe ancestry, male lineage replacement, adoption of Bell Beaker and related material cultures. In Spain, R1b lineages replace local male ancestry almost completely by 2000 BC. In France, Bell Beaker burials reveal the same pattern of steppe-descended men and local women. Germany, the Low Countries, even alpine regions show similar genetic transformations. This wasn't random migration. It was a systematic colonization strategy that succeeded across diverse landscapes and populations. Small groups of technologically advanced, genetically resistant, socially organized males leveraged biological and cultural advantages to achieve demographic dominance across an entire continent. The Bell Beaker phenomenon represents one of the most successful expansions in human history, more successful than Roman conquest, more complete than Germanic migrations, more lasting than Viking raids. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. It wasn't the end of population replacement in Britain. The pattern established by the Bell Beakers would repeat again and again throughout history. The Bell Beaker strategy was so successful that later groups would unconsciously replicate it across British history. Fast forward to the 5th, 7th centuries AD. Anglo-Saxon migrants arrived from Denmark and Germany, bringing new languages, new customs, and new genes. Genetic analysis reveals that in eastern England today, up to 40% of ancestry traces back to these medieval migrants. The pattern is identical to the Bell Beaker expansion. Small groups of organized, technologically advanced males establish elite positions, intermarry with local populations, and over several generations achieve genetic and cultural dominance in specific regions. Viking raids and settlements follow similar patterns. Norman conquest creates another layer of elite replacement. Each wave builds upon the infrastructure established by previous replacements. Even the more recent history of Britain reflects this pattern. Roman elites, Celtic revivals, industrial migrations, modern immigration, all following variations of the same theme, established 4,500 years ago by Bell Beaker pioneers. The genetic legacy is written in modern British DNA. R1BL21, the Bell Beaker male lineage, remains the single most common Y chromosome in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Steppe-derived autosomal DNA constitutes a major component of ancestry across the British Isles. If you've taken a DNA test and discovered Celtic ancestry, you're likely carrying the genetic signature of those Bronze Age revolutionaries who transformed Britain through a combination of bronze, biology, and breeding strategy. Why has this story remained hidden for so long? Why do most people still believe in gradual cultural evolution rather than systematic population replacement? The answer reveals uncomfortable truths about both prehistoric and modern societies. For decades, archaeologists resisted genetic evidence because it challenged fundamental assumptions about human migration and cultural change. The idea that small groups could achieve such complete demographic transformation seemed to validate dangerous political narratives about conquest and replacement. But the DNA doesn't lie. Population replacement isn't a modern invention. It's a recurring pattern throughout human history that becomes visible when we have the tools to detect it. The Bell Beaker transformation of Britain reveals that demographic change can be rapid, systematic, and remarkably efficient when groups possess technological, biological, or social advantages over existing populations. This isn't a story about racial superiority. The Bell Beakers succeeded through circumstances, technology, and strategy, not inherent genetic advantages. Different groups have achieved similar transformations throughout history when conditions aligned in their favor. The Celtic identity that emerged from this transformation became one of the most influential cultural movements in European history. Celtic art, language, religion, and social organization would spread far beyond Britain, influencing Roman culture, Christian monasticism, and medieval European development. Ironically, the people we celebrate as Celtic were themselves the product of population replacement. The romantic warriors of Celtic mythology were descendants of steppe nomads who had erased previous populations and cultures to establish themselves in Western Europe. But perhaps the most forbidden truth of all is this: the Bell Beaker transformation of Britain wasn't an anomaly. It was normal. Population replacement didn't end with the Bell Beakers. It didn't end with the Anglo-Saxons or Vikings or Normans. It continues today through different mechanisms, but following similar patterns. Modern migration, urbanization, differential birth rates, technological advantages, and social mobility create ongoing demographic transformations that will be visible to future geneticists studying 21st century populations. The Bell Beaker legacy teaches us that human populations are far more dynamic than we imagine. The peoples we consider indigenous or native to particular regions are often themselves the descendants of earlier migrants who replaced previous populations. Britain today carries genetic signatures from dozens of population movements: Neolithic farmers, Bell Beaker elites, Celtic expansions, Roman colonists, Anglo-Saxon migrants, Viking raiders, Norman conquerors, medieval traders, industrial workers, and modern immigrants. Each layer adds to the genetic palimpsest that makes up modern British identity. The Bell Beakers were simply the most successful and systematic of these demographic revolutions. Their story challenges us to think differently about identity, ancestry, and belonging. If the native Celts were themselves immigrants who replaced earlier populations, what does it mean to be truly indigenous to any land? The Bell Beaker DNA reset reveals that human history is written not just in the rise and fall of civilizations, but in the quiet genetic revolutions that transform populations through migration, marriage, and adaptation. These genetic resets are happening all around us, in every generation, through every marriage between people of different ancestries. We are all products of population replacement, all carriers of mixed genetic legacies from multiple prehistoric revolutions. The Bell Beakers took Britain not through massacre, but through a more subtle and more complete process. They became Britain. Their genes flow through modern British and Irish veins. Their languages evolved into the Celtic tongues that survived Roman conquest and Saxon settlement. Their bronze-working techniques laid foundations for Britain's later metallurgical excellence. Their warrior culture influenced centuries of British military tradition. In transforming Britain, they created the genetic and cultural substrate for everything that followed: Celtic art and literature, Roman Britain, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, medieval Christendom, the British Empire, and modern multicultural society. The next time you see Stonehenge or hear Celtic music, remember, you're experiencing the legacy of a prehistoric demographic revolution that completely transformed the genetic landscape of these islands. The Bell Beakers didn't just conquer Britain, they became the ancestors of everyone who would later call these islands home. And somewhere in your own DNA, if you trace your ancestry to these Atlantic islands, those Bronze Age revolutionaries live on, their genetic signature preserved across 4,500 years of human history. The Celtic DNA reset wasn't just ancient history, it's your history, written in the language of genes and carried forward in every generation that followed. The forbidden truth is that we are all replacements, all immigrants, all carrying the genetic legacy of someone else's demographic revolution. The Bell Beakers simply did it better than almost anyone else in human history. Their success reminds us that the story of human migration and population change is far from over. New genetic resets are beginning even now, written in the DNA of children whose ancestors came from different continents, different cultures, different genetic histories. The Bell Beaker revolution continues, one marriage at a time, one generation at a time, one genetic recombination at a time. History isn't what happened to other people in the distant past. History is what's happening to us right now, written in our genes and carried forward into an uncertain but genetically diverse future. The Celtic DNA reset teaches us that change is not only possible, it's inevitable, and sometimes it transforms everything. Thanks for watching.